With that, we'll go ahead and call this Tax Fairness Equity Subcommittee to order. The vice chair will be briefly late. He had texted me this morning. And so a few opening comments here. We're going to try to go through this business. This is that kind of the identification of problems days and that conversation, that those area that fit within our area. The obviously there are 3 other areas, so we don't have to completely, we don't have to repeat what they're doing as well. We're going to try to keep this, I'm going to use the slideshow to keep us kind of on track where we are. With the slideshow is aligned to follow this agenda you see in front of you. As always, I do want folks to speak up if they have a question. I won't always see it. Again, I see something on a chat coming up, so we must have a question about items, but at this point, we're going to follow the agenda as laid out. So anyway, with that, we'll get started. We'll and work through this agenda. It's just the way to begin. So roll call, I guess I need to do that. Mr. Franklin.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I think I need someone who actually has a list of the panelists to go through that, because I don't have one with me here. I forgot to print one.
Okay, I don't have the list sitting right in front of me either. I can look it up, but Ryan, do you happen to have the list of the various groups close? Sandra Vasecki is asking to be promoted as well while we're waiting for our list of panelists. I think so. Gordon, I probably well, I hate messing with my Zoom screen. I'll screw it up. Yeah. So
I'm going to find the list and we'll read.
We've got the list right here. We have the list for roll call here.
Okay, go ahead and do the roll call, please.
Okay. Chair Jones.
Here.
Vice Chair O'Hare.
He's coming. He's excused. He said he'd be slightly late.
Member Fern.
Here.
Member Horpadal.
Here.
I will just have to look at everything.
Member Johnson.
I don't know off the top of my head.
Cindy is excused. Gordon, you've got to turn your mic off.
Yep. Okay. Member Olkers.
I am here.
And Member Wiggers.
Here.
Great. And again, I'm Ryan Evans. We have several of the staff members here today, so we'll certainly give it back over to Chair Jones, and we're happy to take down any questions, and we'll go from there. Mr. Chair.
Okay. So again, we have a promote request in the question and answer section to have you folks check. Please watch that, and with that, we'll get started. So there are some considerations that were sent out by the Office of Program so that we get some consistency with the subs that we should consider when we evaluate these policy questions. I'm going to hope that as we talk about some of these, we will refer to these evaluation questions or thoughts. And so each time we look at a proposed policy, the thought is we need to look at, is there a tax shift that's being caused between the various property classes? Is this causing a tax shift between property taxes and income tax payers? Is there a tax shift between Montana residents and out-of-state residents? What is the impact on local government and public school funding, and both in the short and the long term? What happens through time? Is there a differential effect on the counties across the state? We talked about that at our beginning meeting. What might be really beneficial for one county can be terrible for another county. We're also talked, and this was actually the words I borrowed from Vice Chair O'Hare, the long-term effects on the Montana's tax system. And the thought there, and we'll talk some about that as we get started here. Imagine for where the puck is moving versus a solution for the past, right? So we know Montana's evolving. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go in, but we don't need to create a solution for the past as we move to the future. And also we know that a lot of the last couple, 3 years has had some anomalies associated with the COVID event. So creating a solution for an anomaly that's falling off makes little sense as well. And of course, when we do and decide we're going to pursue something, it's going to potentially cause some statutory changes. We need to make sure we identify what these are. So those are the evaluation. I believe that's all of them, yep, that were sent out. At this point, we're going to revisit briefly what appears to be long-term impacts and what appears to be anomaly related. And I guess only time answers that question perfectly, but this was the best split we could come up with to at least initiate the conversation before we went into looking at specific policies. You've all seen this slide before. And basically, to me, it was one of the slides that's most telling. We've had this conversation where for years and years and years, the Yellowstone, which was the center of Montana's natural resource system, the oil, the coal, the gas, was a top tax value in the state until it wasn't. And now you can see, and it didn't just happen during COVID. You can see the trend lines were going before COVID, where Gallatin and the Flathead, the more tourist-related economies and move into destinations are increasing. Madison with 9,000 people, an example of a move-in destination economy. You've seen this chart, won't spend a lot of time on it, but so we'll go to the next one. Some additional charts. Dang it, something came up right over the top of my, there we go. And let me click once more here. This chart also gives evidence of a change that's been going on in Montana. And I remember when I first came into the legislature looking at what the other taxes and the natural resources and thinking, wow, we really do have a three-legged stool, because the combination of those two were significant. And over time, natural resources has literally stayed flat. And when you consider inflation, it has substantially declined as a share of Montana's base. So you can see even in these charts, this has been continuing. And now that appears to be a long-term trend. It's certainly been a trend from 1980 to 2022. I guess there's arguments can be made. There's bumps here and there, the Bakken oil boom in 08, but it appears to be a trend. And it also has appeared that some of our other taxes, with a little turn up here going on at the end, we'll talk some of that, have also been quite flat. So I think that chart and if someone wants to say something, since I can't see raised hands real easy, just speak up. I'll try to watch for them. But chart right here, and I will note that Cindy Johnson is on as well. We've also seen, and even this has been a long-term trend. If you look at this as a growth of Montana's lodging taxes, and you can see through this period of time that there has been a steady growth in the lodging tax, even pre-COVID. It was outpacing CPI and population. Of course, we have this area right here that boomed. The question we have is, how far back does it come? Or have we reestablished? Have we been discovered? Is it continuing? That'll be an interesting conversation. There appears to be at least some evidence that it's going to continue at a higher level, a Hawaii-like effect. Here's a growth of residential in Montana through the 13 to 23, the last decade timeframe. Here's the growth in houses over $1.5 million. And so again, kind of an evidence of a destination demand. And you notice they were growing before COVID. They just exploded in COVID. Is this trend continuing? We know the names of a bunch of these areas across the state. This time we added the short-term rental graph to the chart. The Airbnb type charts, they didn't exist too far back, but there seems to be an explosion of short-term rentals, those homes, etc., that act very much like a hotel, but are in the residential neighborhoods. Again, there doesn't seem to be a backing off on that trend as well. And this chart I found interesting. It's fairly difficult. This is a good idea by the Department of Revenue. We've been trying to figure out, it's hard to tell by just looking at property taxes unless you can cross-reference what is the growth in out-of-state ownership. And so I highlighted the line down there. This is the market value of unique property numbers out of state. And when you think about how big a number you're talking about, it appears to be hammering along, growing well in the last few years, 1% or so a year. It'll be interesting to see what 2022 and 23 brings, but there at least at this point appears to be a trend, an increase in out-of-state ownership. We have a panelist with her hand up, Dylan.
Yeah, Representative Jones. Sorry, our signals got kind of crossed on this. This is from some work I did for the Revenue Interim Committee back in 2021, and I did update this table, but it didn't make it. But we sent the wrong table over for the PowerPoint, I guess is the point. So in 2023, the out-of-state ownership is now 20% of market value and 22% of taxable value for residential property.
So it has continued to grow then at over 1% a year. It would be good when we send this chart out. I would love to have that one added. It would be good to have that because again, that means it's gone from 2016 at 15.1%. And Dylan, what is it in 2023?
It's 20.3% for market value and 21.9% for taxable. And so again, I'll point out, I guess, since this is my table at this point now. So the taxable value is a greater share than the market value. So what that's suggesting is that these out-of-state homes tend to be in that 1.5 million differential point where they're receiving a higher tax rate than the average class 4 residential property. Also draw your attention to, actually it's not included in this. Sorry, I really wish we could have had the other table. What I showed in that is the average tax rate for properties. So for in-state properties, the average tax rate is 1.33%, which is actually slightly below the standard class 4 residential rate of 1.35. And what that's suggesting is, well, it's being brought down slightly by the properties that are participating in PTAP, the Property Tax Assistance Program, and the Montana Disabled Veterans Program. And then on the other hand, these out-of-state addresses have an average tax rate of 1.47, which is 12% or 0.12 percentage points higher than the regular class 4 tax rate. And that's, again, because there are many of these properties that are in that 1.5 million differential tax rate.
And we have a couple hands up on this slide, just because this is a base of a lot of the later stuff. So Rhonda.
So my question is on the count of unique property numbers. I see that the market value is going up and the taxable value is going up, but the percentage of count is not really going up. Is it continue in 22 and 23 to remain at that 10.5% or does the number jump up in count as well?
Yeah, great question. It's pretty constant. I think it is fair to say that there's not an increasing share of homes that are out-of-state addresses. And I guess, this all should be couched in the sense that what this analysis is doing is looking at the mailing address on the property record. And if your mailing address is out of state, then we're categorizing you as an out-of-state owner. There's definitely people that don't actually reside in Montana that get their property tax bill mailed to the property itself. There's no way to account for that. When I was talking about this with Ralph, he pointed out that maybe there's snowbird effects where people are residents of Montana, but maybe they get their mail shipped to their Arizona house or whatever if they're there at that time of the year when the tax bill comes. There's no way for us to know exactly. This is just a proxy. But I think it's safe to say that the percentage of out-of-state mailing address is not changing, but the property value continues to rise for those people that have out-of-state mailing addresses faster than the rest of the state.
relative property value. And so our question to Dylan had been to come up with some proxy if the thesis or the concept was that the property values held by out-of-state owners relative to in-state owners, because in-state owners are the income taxpayers, was growing. Was there anything we could use as a proxy until at some point we actually do a data point to collect on this? And obviously with the flaws he stated, this still appears to be a movement that matches what our eyes see, that there's an increase in both the valuation of the market value percentage. 20% is a significant portion. It's our taxable value appears to be mailed to an out-of-state address. And I'm sure there's some in-state properties that are held by out-of-state owners as well. The taxes get sent to the property and some caretaker forwards it. But this was a proxy to try to indicate what we appeared to be seeing, for lack of a better tool. Am I correct on that, Dylan? That was your thought?
Yep, I think that's a great summary of it.
Okay. And again, this chart you've seen before, but I always like bringing it up, saying we have seen as the industrial commercial declines, the residential grows both in value and number. We've seen that residential makes up a growing portion of the total market value of the state of Montana. It's grown in 20 years from about 57%, 58% to 76%. And as a result, it's growing in tax collections from 45.5 to 58%. And these two, again, and we've looked at this slide, so I'm not spending much time on it. There is a discount that was occurring of about 21% here. The discount on residential is even higher now. It's just so much more market share. And we talked about the tax shift. As this works around, you can see the tax shift to the other classes that are going on. These appear to be ongoing changes. This is a 20-year chart. There appears to be an ongoing shift from other classes of property to residential in total market value in the state, and a subsequent shift in taxes, although not at the same rate that it's growing. There appears to be a shift in ownership of the market value of Montana to out-of-state owners that in the last few years has accelerated to about 1% a year. And if I say something wrong, Dylan, please speak up, because I may be missing something. I'm happy to be called on something wrong. We have an attendee with their hand up. Rep Beatty would like to be promoted, I assume. And I'm going to go to the next slide. Now there seems to be some one-time only events, and we always hear, and again, I wanted to sort them. We always hear about the huge state surplus. And oh my goodness, it can be used ongoing. Well, the huge state surplus had some interesting drivers. These numbers I'm quite familiar with. I look at this stuff all the time. This is the total reported capital gains on returns. And we always expected this number to be in the $3 billion range, $2.5, $3 billion. It hit $9 billion in a year. It just exploded. And it appears to be dropping off just like exploded. So it caused a great, I called it a burp, in the income tax system. This appears to be continuing back towards a normal trend. It'll be interesting if it comes back to the $3 billion range or not, but we certainly are not seeing where it was. It's certainly not driving income tax at the rate it was. Appears to be a one-time only event. We also just got buried, and this is just the state side, in this stimulus dollars, right? We kind of had our revenue predictions going forward, and then we just got buried with the dollars coming in that were stimulus, the OTO dollars, and the OTO effect from those dollars, and the inflation that again caused, well, you can see it caused the surplus to come off. This also appears to be returning to trend, and in fact, I'll be surprised if it doesn't return further than these charts already show. We certainly know that this here it is right here. This is what hit the state of Montana. And you've got to remember, property taxes bringing in about $2 billion. General fund is $2.5 billion, was a little less then. And we got $14.1 billion of federal stimulus dropped in some manner into the state of Montana. Not all to the state, right? But this is across the entire state. It was just a flood of money. It became inflationary. A contractor could basically say whatever price they wanted. That appears to be going away too, right? And well, it's definitely not the stimulus out there. There's still some of it out on the ground, but it's disappearing. We see in houses, and we just put 2 towns on this chart. I asked them to come up with a chart for me, and the easiest look at the demand for housing is days on the market. And so you can see that period of time, and this is both Billings and Bozeman, where if you had a house that sold in under 10 days, right, it just fell off the market. You can see that it's beginning to bounce around like it did in the past. It seems to be that the days on the market between the higher interest rate or prices or some combination thereof seems to have been slowing that. The general thought, while the work's not done out there, is that residential values are certainly not going to be, are certainly unlikely to increase as they did in the past. We'll see if we can get some estimates on that. And in fact, there may be areas where residential decreases some. You're certainly seeing time on the market, you had in these ranges, it seems to be coming back. And finally, we did talk about, we've talked about this, but just to say it one more time, so we go in here, there was a one-time only event, and at least for the owner dwellings, we took a look at that. We did get it slightly wrong. We had thought that $675 would cover the property tax increase of the median owner dwelling everywhere. In truth, it did everywhere except the Gallatin. In fact, when you do it off the average numbers, you're going to find it was more than about 2.5 times, and it's happening for these 2 years. So we tried to cover the OTO event until we came up with a longer one. And I also put the 95 mills in there. They're always a topic of conversation, but you can see where the 95 mills are on this chart. If only applied to the state mills, the 675 was covered the one's total taxes paid. The other one, 675, covered a multitude of times, probably on the average about 6 times, but everywhere at least 2.5 times. And finally, this was a chart I hadn't seen. This must be Dylan or Eric Dale. Somebody built this chart. I liked this chart. I hadn't seen this one till now. I see a lot of these charts before, or versions of them. But what this chart shows is that 73% of Montanans experienced no residential, no increase in the property taxes on their home if they factor in the $675 rebate, right? They were flat to down. 27% were subsidized, but did see an increase. And so again, when owner, the point being is the OTO event for at least 2 years, there was efforts made to adjust to. And I guess before I leave the OTO events and the responses to it, and ongoing versus temporary, are there questions on that section? And then we'll talk about some of the policy ideas put forth. So homestead exemption, we'll go through some of these. There's a couple of ways this has been brought up. I will bring us back to these. I got them on my screen as well. The questions after we talk about what these things are, then we'll ask, what do they do to the questions? What do they do under our policy considerations? So, and I just threw these up again. You've seen them, because as we talk about these, I'll bring us back to these questions over and over again and say, what is it doing to whom? So right now, the LFD and you want to make sure he's promoted, because I'm going to ask him some questions here. Yep, Nick's on here. This is the LFD's tool, and we're adding some options to the tool. They're not all added yet. If you haven't played with the property tax tool, I suggest you do. So a lot of this work will come out of that tool, as well as the work the DOR is doing. So we're putting some additions to our property tax model tool. We've got a few of them added already. And So you can see where we are already. You can monkey with the residential rates. You can play around with the 95 mils, and you can change the GTB ratio in the tool, and it'll propagate this not just for the state, but across every county, every city, every taxable entry entity, and you can see that. Where we're going, and it's not operational yet, is we're going to be able to add a homestead exemption percentage to it. You can see the kind of graph that Nick put together on the side there, and a commercial exemption. That's going to be added to this tool, as well as the possibility to cap the level these extensions apply to. So for example, you could say, let's apply a 50% homestead exemption up to a $2 million house, or whatever numbers you choose. And so here's an example of a potential one. In fact, it was I always use this as our starting point. That doesn't mean that it's anything other than a starting point. But when we started talking about how to map this out, I always say, well, let's just imagine we increased the residential tax for the state of Montana to 2.2%, but we gave a 50% homestead exemption to owner dwellings and long-term rentals. So you'd be getting a 1.1% on if it was an owner dwelling or a long-term rental. And again, you could put a cap in there at some level if you wanted. But does that general concept make sense? And this would be, our previous homestead exemption was for every piece of property. This would be designed in a manner to try to be able to touch or deal with the differential between in-state ownership and out-of-state ownership, right? Because you would assume that the out-of-state owners, obviously that aren't paying income tax, are not going to qualify for the exemption. And so this would be the thought of one of the homestead models. Hopefully this tool, and let me go through, here's where the tool currently is. And Nick, at this point, I guess I'll start with this slide. Where are we at on this, and your thoughts, discussions, and I'll let Nick speak to this, and I'll change slides when you ask me, Nick.
Sure. So you can hear me, correct?
Yes.
All right. So I'm Nick Van Brown. I work for the Legislative Fiscal Division. Yes, we have created this tool which gets at property taxes paid for whatever kind of area you're looking at. And at this point, Kurt and Julia have built in the sliders that you saw for residential rate, the 95 mils, and then a GTB ratio. We will be displaying that at the LFC meeting on the 15th because it is not currently rolled out. You can see this property tax model online now, but without those sliders. Those sliders will be rolling out at LFC. Additionally, and this request came in after, we are trying to get a homeowner and a Comstead exemption in there. And so what that would allow us to do on these is to slide any of these to the rates or mills or GTV ratios or exemption amounts that you are interested in to see how things would adjust. This is going to take a couple months, I'm guessing. It really relies on a lot of the work that TPR and OPI and Ralph up in the budget office, they are all looking at this, but this just allows you to change your, kind of choose your own adventure on these things. But to get there, we need to estimate some taxable value changes and budget changes going forward. So those are things that we have to draw out into the future to kind of get at how those would change in the future. The one thing that we needed, and Dylan has already gotten us this was just received, I think last week, is those $675 rebates. So there's really no way to know how many properties are homeowners, like primary homeowners. That is the $675 rebate is the best piece of information we have on that. It may not be complete. There may be people who did not apply for it for, either didn't know, didn't want to for some reason or another, different reasons, but this is the best data that we have for which pieces of property are actually homeowners. There is a second round coming out, and Dylan, I believe we're gonna get that in December. December-ish, that may be even more complete. And what that's really allowing us to do is to see which properties are people claiming are their primary residences. And that's what we need to kind of see to make these adjustments to a homeowner exemption. So if you want to adjust, however you may be interested in adjusting, you have to know which and how many pieces of property you would want to adjust to. So that's what this will do. It's a bit of a swag, because once again, these are just based on who applied, but it's the best we have at this moment.
Okay, resources.
Yeah.
And I need,
Can I say
Sorry.
some things too? Rep.
yes,
Jones?
Bill, absolutely. This, I need people to understand it, so absolutely.
Sure. So like Nick was saying, this rebate data is really sort of the first great glimpse that we've gotten into home ownership. So the Department of Revenue does not collect information on whether a home is your first, second, third, fourth, whatever. So this rebate data, what it allows us to do is say for sure the person that owns this property uses this as their primary home. It doesn't allow us perfect information on all people. If you guys go back and look at the fiscal note for the rebate, we expected considerably more properties to apply than did. So there's a lot of ideas floating around about why that is. We will have the second round of rebates going out in August of this year, and we should have finalized data on those rebates probably by November. So we will have pretty good data about primary home owner occupied. Long-term rental is going to be much more of a shot in the dark. And as far as LFD implementing that into their tool, yeah, that's going to be a little more questionable. That's going to be going off census data or some kind of third-party data. We're not going to have data on that. So that will be more of an estimate than the homeowner aspect, and people should be aware of that.
So again, the thought process I've heard set forth over and over again had been Montana homeowners and Montana long-term renters need to have some help in the residential property tax. And so that was where this concept found its beginning. Dave, I see you've got a typed question. Are you unable to? I see you mic'd up. Can you just ask?
Yeah. My question, I'm intrigued by the whole thought of the homestead exemption. What I'm wondering is how it would affect mills if there is not enough properties that will not be eligible for an exemption to prevent mills from going up. That makes sense.
So I can talk about how we plan on implementing this. So, and obviously we will implement it as people are interested in seeing it, but the way we've been thinking about implementing it is the exemption will have a straight reduction to something like the state mills to the state dollars, basically. But at the local level, we are going to hold those budgets constant, because I think that's how it's basically how that would work at this point. And as those exemptions and things come in, you would see shifts to other classes of property as those exemptions occurred. And if they were, and if it's a place where there's primarily homeowners, you will see shifts primarily to other homeowners. So if we keep those budgets constant and shift any of these things around, you will see shifts to other properties, whether they're in the same class or in different classes. And that's what the other page with our tools will be showing, the class differential as you shift those, because that's the assumption that we're going off at this point, is that schools and locals will have that budget held constant. will go with their budget limitations.
Well, and if you think through it, and I've got a couple more questions, but if you think through it, right, until we play with the numbers, the 2.2% is going to bring in some additional revenue, 50%. And I made these two numbers up, right? So I just needed some number to show how the tool worked. But let's stick with this one. For a second, the 2.2% is going to bring in additional revenues on what appears to be about 20% I don't know what the short-term rentals would add to, but let's just say on 20+% of the properties. That's going to bring in more money, but those properties aren't equally located everywhere. So it's going to impact different areas differently. That additional money, depending which county you're in, it's going to help it's potentially going to allow additional money to, in a certain county, it might be a perfect, we could maybe get it perfect statewide in a given county. It could have very little relative shift. In another county that has none of these properties, it could represent a shift to other classes. The reason we got to look at it across counties is that stuff always shifts, and it's the magnitude of these changes. And do we have a cap in these changes? Do we say this only occurs up to a $2 million home, a $5 million home? And actually the caps we've been talking about are more dynamic than that. We've been saying, okay, the cap's going to be something that moves through time, like 6 times the 5 or 6 times the median house value, so you don't always have to adjust the cap. But once the model exists, it'll begin to answer some of those questions. What shifts to whom in what county, and so but it keeps it within the property tax system itself. You know, and with that, we'll go through our little questions. But Rhonda, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, a couple of questions I have. One, just a note, it isn't 20% of the houses that were out of state. It was 20% of the market value. So when we're shifting, we do need to be aware that what it looks like is the percentage of houses owned by out of state remain the same. It's that their value increased extensively for taxable value reasons. So that'll change in how we shift things. My second question came in a little bit in how we were counting with the rebates. And it's just a question for DOR to know whether it's in the count or not. I know when the rebates went out, heard of a number of places that if you had your home in a trust, or if it was part of your ag corporation or your business corporation that owned your house, that those rebates, you could not apply for that rebate. Or my mom's friend did a lot of work, and I don't know if she ever was able to get her rebate because her house is in a trust, family trust. Was DOR able to address those, or are we not counting anybody whose home that they live in was, did they not get the rebates? Because that will make a difference. They'll still get the owner dwelling 50% rebate, but they wouldn't have got the $675 because we didn't send them to businesses or anybody who was not an individual. Or did we fix it?
And I believe Cindy Johnson has a question that's somewhat similar to that I see in the chat.
So I'm not, I wasn't involved in the rebate process personally, so I'm not super well versed in this, but the devil is going to be in the details on how you construct this. And the way the rebate was constructed was to exclude LLCs and businesses from receiving these rebates. So I believe that revocable trusts got the rebate, but irrevocable did not. So those kind of details do matter. And to your question, Rhonda, yes, if a business or if a property did not receive the rebate in whatever tool we create, it's not going to be counted. And so that just goes to show how limited this data is. This is the best data we've ever had, but it still has a lot of limitations in how we can apply it and what conclusions we can draw from these tools.
Cindy, did that answer your question? I see you texted a question in the chat, or do you need it expanded? And maybe Cindy's...
We're going to be able to hear her.
No, we probably can't hear her. So if you need additional on that, Cindy, type some more. And Jeremy, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. And as the out-of-stater here, I'm just trying to learn about the history of your property tax system. So my understanding is there used to be a homestead exemption prior to 2015, 2016, and that was removed at that point. Is that correct? Am I understanding the history right?
It's a different homestead exemption. And so
That was
yes,
all
there used to
residential?
be a homestead exemption, but if you fit under the category of residential, it didn't matter whether you're in-state or out-of-state, long-term or short-term, it applied to all residential.
Okay, and so what was the main logic for getting rid of that in 2015, 2016? If anyone knows the history.
I guess I do as well. It was causing, it became complicated, right? So there was a homestead and a Comstead exemption running then. And what was happening is we were running a 6-year appraisal cycle coming up to 2015. And so one of the things that happened is because a lot of the items were on a 2-year appraisal and a lot were on a 6, you were getting weird impacts hitting the residential that was on the 6-year. If property dropped, say there was an oil movement, it dropped, the drop came in only after 6 years. If it increased, it was this big step. And so primarily this became a tool to move to smooth those impacts, right? You could adjust that percentage. If you go back, and there was a chart in the first meeting that showed how those percentages were adjusted to arrive at a rate. As everything moved to a 2-year, the thought had become, and where it was doing nothing special with classes, in fact, in the last year of its existence, I believe it was 131 or something, it had almost generated the same exact rate. The thought was, let's just make this stuff go away and have a rate. Everything's going to a 2-year and not try to figure this out. This homestead exemption is different in that it's trying to say you have to be an owner dwelling or only a long term. This is an attempt to recognize that there's a growing market value, and I would argue the data is going to support a build out as well, but a market value of certainly taxable value of out-of-state ownership we don't have a sales tax, that don't participate in our income tax, and potentially as we look to figure out services and we wish to touch the long terms and the owner dwellings, that we have to have a revenue source.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, so our questions we talk about on these, and maybe this time I'll go back to them instead of just saying them. Tax shift between various property classes of this one. We talked about that briefly, right? And we won't know till the model gets built, and what the numbers you put in the model and the capping are going to impact that greatly. Guys, if I get this wrong, you guys are the tax guys, say you got that wrong, Lou. Tax shift between property taxes and income taxpayers. This primarily exists within the property tax, although to the extent that it impacts 95 mills, and what percentage of that is going to the adequacy side, you could have some impact on the income tax side, but I don't think it would be particularly significant there. I wouldn't assume so anyway. Again, the devil will be in the details. Tax shift between Montana residents and out-of-state residents. I believe this would shift taxes towards out-of-state residents. Local government and short-term public school funding. I don't think it'd have a significant effect there. Again, to the extent that it actually changes some of the 95 mil collections, it could, but if it's designed reasonably well, it probably would not. Differential effects on counties across the state, absolutely. That's why we have the tool. We got to wait till it runs to see. It's going to be substantially differential. Long-term effects of Montana tax system. Imagine to where the puck is moving. Well, to the extent that we've seemed to be growing, at least in market and taxable value, 1% a year of what appears to be out-of-state ownership, it would move some more burden that direction. Creating the solution that's likely an anomaly COVID event. I don't know. I don't think you're going to see residential increase at the rate it did, but only time tells that story. As you look at these questions, and of course, identification of statutory changes is the last one, which didn't appear. There it is. Obviously, there would be some statutory changes. But I guess before we talk about that too, Rhonda, you got your hand up again.
Yeah, I just want to point out that the tax shift between Montana residents and out-of-state residential property owners, I understand what we're trying to do, and I'm looking forward to seeing this, to being able to play with that system, the new model. But I do know there are only 56,000 properties that are identified in the state that are out-of-state property owners. If we increase, I just think raising that 2.2 and then giving back and then the residential rebate, I think what we're going to discover is that there's a lot of shift to commercial properties, to ag properties, to those properties that are owned by Montanans, but maybe in a business, owned inside a business. Or I think you'll also discover a lot of these are also just the house in town or the ranch. You can't live in both and call them both your primary residence. Same for your cabin in Monarch, things like that. Having looked at this before, I understand our target of trying to get rich out-of-state people. But when doing that, I think we're gonna see a shift more than we think to other Montana people's business properties. So I just want us to be aware that this might not be the panacea we were hoping for.
Yep, it's the devil will be in the details of what the numbers are in the tool. And if you're going to change taxes, they always go somewhere. Both are true statements. So let's see. Dave, you had your hand up, but you put it back down, I believe.
No, I was going to just comment on what Rhonda said, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I also think something we should consider is, the appraisal process, just generally looking through 15 active tax categories, I think is somewhat subjective when it's just dependent on how the market works and how subjective the market is, especially for residential. So I guess what I'm getting at is when I see the charts that look at the lack of growth of certain categories, I just wonder, if they are recipients of a small tax shift upward, might that be appropriate because they've sort of been flat for so long? And in a way, the appraisal system, isn't perfect and maybe is working disproportionately, and that perhaps the only way to level things out is a sense there'll be winners and losers in this, and how we can flatten it out enough so the losers, I guess if they're not out of state, is pretty minimal, but it still may happen. That's my thought.
Yeah, it's winners and losers, always will be. The appraisal system, I know they have that tested at times, and it seems like that Montana as a state, when looked at statewide, is considered fairly accurate overall. It certainly has had challenges in areas at times that have been successful, but I know they've done some analysis in that. In fact, you guys quoted some of the numbers when you were compared against your peers, and I believe it was the statewide appraisal system, for as much as it's maligned, seems to do it about as accurate as it can be done at that time. But devil will be in the details, and then equity will be in the eye of the beholder. The other type of homestead.
I was just going to say, one other thing, it would be interesting sometime to look at an analysis of the AB 26s that occur in the state, see what the increase in the rate of those county to county are, and see if there are some general themes to that may. I think, Lou, you were looking at a rate, said a grade of like 97% when we looked at the effectiveness of appraisals, but just to hone down on if there are any improvements needed and where they may be.
So since we stopped on that for a second, you guys have done this appraisal. Is someone there that would speak just briefly to, because you do look at those AB 26s, you do look at the accuracy on the 3-step. Just speak to that generally, because that might be something that's obviously worth investigating. But because I don't want to put words in your mouth, I just remember what you said a couple times, whoever wishes to.
Eric, you want to take it or you want me
All
to
right,
do
I
it?
was afraid. No, I can do it. Representative Jones,
It was nice.
essentially, the department goes through a pretty rigorous process after the appraisal values are put into the system. And what we do is we look at properties that have sold. And then we take those sale prices and use that as a measure of the quote unquote true market value of the property and compare that to what the department has assessed that value to be. Based on that type of analysis, the state has done very well in the past several cycles. Definitely within the IAAO standards, which are sort of the standards that we try to abide by. I believe an acceptable appraisal level is somewhere between 90 and 110% of the true market value. We generally come in somewhere in the neighborhood of 95 to 101%. So it is a pretty tight bound. Not that there aren't exceptions, that is a statewide number. And certainly if there's anybody out there that feels their property is not valued appropriately, file an AB 26. Additionally, we have looked at sort of the differences between the method that was used to value the property to see if there is any systematic differences. So for example, are properties being valued using the cost approach undervalued relative to their true market value, or the market approach? We haven't found anything that would indicate that at this point, although every cycle we do update those numbers. So hopefully that answers your question, but if you'd like me to go deeper, I certainly can.
So I'm going to resist this rabbit hole at this point because it'll get us away off the models. I'm happy to work on that, but since it's not an agenda item, I just wanted to touch on it. I see there's a Q&A up. And
Mr.
so
Mendenhall.
Mendenhall had made a statement, but I think he was basically saying the same thing you did, Eric. So there is another type of homestead exemption. I was proposed, and again, this was the amount proposed in the bill, $390. It is always the more simple one, and that's you directly transfer the homestead exemption to the income tax, right? This bill proposed a $50,000 backfill homestead exemption for owned properties paid for by the state general fund, which is primarily income tax. One property at a time. You couldn't get multiple deals, and they listed the ones on it. I just kind of summarized the bill. It's online. You can look at its fiscal note. It would have pinged the income tax $17 million. We've seen versions of this one come up every so often, but it again. So do we understand generally that one? This is always the simpler one. It just says the income tax, the general fund will pay it. And this one did not have a long-term renter in it, this particular one. So if we go up to and I don't know why I didn't just put it in here, our questions here, this isn't really a tax shift between property taxes. It is absolutely a tax shift between property taxpayers and income taxpayers. This one would actually shift from out-of-state residential owners to Montana residents, because I believe, because the out-of-state residents do not pay W-2 income tax, right? Impact on local government and public school funding. Again, to the extent the income tax has sufficient funding in it, I guess. You got to remember that the income tax or the general fund, 93% of it exports already to education, medication, and incarceration. And so to the extent you run us out of income tax, you run us out of money to export. Differential effects across the counties. Well, some counties, $50,000 might be a significant portion of their home value. In Gallatin, it's not. So we'd have to look at that. To manage where the puck is moving, I don't know on that one. Solution to an anomaly. So on the conversations, and I see the QA popped up again, conversations on that as well.
Sorry, I maybe should have cut you off earlier on that, Lou, but so I wrote the fiscal note for Department of Revenue on this bill. There was a county shift for sure. The cost of the general fund is just the reduction in the 95 mills. So this is an example, I think, of so Rep. Jones' idea to not cost the state. Well, it's not the general fund anymore. It's state special revenue for the 95 mills. But that's the point, I guess, of raising the residential overall rate to 2.2 and then offering a reduction to primary homeowners, whereas this just offered a reduction to primary homeowners without increasing the residential rate to everyone. So when you do that, the 95 mills brings in less money. And then there is a tax shift amongst the different classes and the people that do not receive the benefit. Will you go back to that slide, Rep. Jones? We can talk about some of the particulars of the bill. So the bill said that you couldn't also get the benefits of a different property tax reduction. And so I knew from analysis that we had done on circuit breaker proposals that oftentimes our, in particular, the Montana Disabled Veteran Program gives substantially higher benefits than usually what these properties would receive under alternative means-based things. So what I specifically did was looked at, are you receiving more of a benefit under the current program you're in rather than this? So I do think that's something that should be considered for these exemptions is, do you want to allow them to double dip into different preferential programs for the property? I think there's arguments to be made for doing that and for not doing that. It's something to consider. And I think that's most of what I wanted to say. This one was a flat reduction. That's also an option to consider, is giving a flat reduction to properties rather than a percentage reduction. What that does is it benefits people with more modest homes than a percentage reduction does.
Okay, and so Eric, I guess what Dylan was talking about this. So the 17 million, so you shifted the 17 million was a state impact. You were backfilling this, because I should have went and looked at the fiscal notes. You backfilled this by transferring to other properties on the local level, is what you're saying.
Yep, I just pulled the fiscal note up. It was an estimate of $166 million in taxable value reduction. And so that's about 5% of the statewide total. So that taxable value reduction would be made up in mill increases, presumably at the local level.
Okay. Dave?
Thanks. I just wanted to throw in some thoughts on the higher valued properties and out-of-state properties. This is just my observation from a wealthy neighborhood we have in my district is, generally speaking, these folks are mostly out of state and mostly spending limited time in our area. In exchange for not getting the W-2s, I'm going to guess we probably get about $15,000 or so per property on property taxes, and there's pretty limited impact on requirements as far as city services and that sort of thing goes. So I don't want to make it seem like, I'm trying to be overly sympathetic to some of our part-time residents where money is not particularly an object, but I think we have to be careful how we evaluate this, in that, especially at the local level, some of these properties in Gallatin or Madison County or whatever are really helping to subsidize projects like school bonds and that sort of thing at a disproportionate level. So I'm just saying that they are contributing, and it's just something to think about as we put this stuff together.
And that's more back to the previous homestead exemption, not this one, right? Because this
Right.
one's more.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting, think about cost shifts and you looked at asking what are the metrics to consider for potential options, and I thought, generally speaking, a metric or an evaluating factor may be that it would be better if we could avoid tax shifts as much as possible. The other thing, and maybe just semantics, is, I'm not sure I would call a tax shift, use that term between income tax, moving income tax money. I would kind of look at it as more a choice of allocation of how we use the income tax, meaning a sort of a legislative decision. It definitely moves money around differently, but I see that as sort of a unique situation. So when we look at circuit breakers, the one circuit breaker we have with the elderly homeowners, it's just, I guess it's just something to consider.
See, and I actually see that as a shift because in particular in modern day Montana, it's pretty easy to headquarter a corporation somewhere else, even if your employees are here. It's pretty easy to declare a residence somewhere else. And that seems to be, given that you can't move an oil well or a mine, it didn't used to be as much of a factor as it appears to be today. And so when we move to the income tax system, to me, we're saying, and it's primarily W-2, we're saying we are shifting to the guys down in a house, in my mind, that lives in the neighborhood that likely might be paying property tax as well. It's definitely transferring to somewhere. But again, that's the nuances. So 2 homestead exemptions. Possibilities. I assume we're going to continue to flesh these thoughts out. We'll talk about that a little further down. But these were both homestead exemptions that were sent in. We'll just talk briefly. I got to watch my clock here. We will drop briefly about the Comstead exemption. So the current commercial tax rate is 1.89%, and it's linked to 1.4, the residential rate. Obviously, if we begin to monkey with the residential rate, we're going to have to think about that, either decouple it and it has its own rate, or some form of Comstead exemption for Montana businesses. There has been some discussions that get sent in on that. That's why I listed it. There's some thoughts that, well, a Comstead exemption could also be targeted to help small businesses on Main Street. I just, again, made these numbers up because until you have something to have a model to look at, I was just trying to provide an example. Let's say the commercial rate went to 2%, but if you were a Montana business that paid income tax in Montana, then maybe you'd get the first $2 million or up to the first $2 million of your property would get a 25% exemption. LFD will have to model this. The Comstead exemption was always linked in the past. It was kind of a weird thing that came into Montana back in the past. I just put it in here because it got brought up. We got to watch your clock a little bit, guys. I know, Rhonda, you had worked on this as well, and I see your hands up.
Just a quick comment on the Montana-owned business and the Comstead, and I actually think it was some testimony I gave in protest of decreasing Class 4, transferring it to rental property and renters that got us a Comstead exemption in the mid 90s. However, remember, if we're going to do a Comstead exemption for Montana-owned businesses, that at the federal level, there is a 20% tax decrease for anyone who is a pass-through business. And by becoming a pass-through business, you're automatically going to make yourself no longer a Montana-owned business because you'll be incorporated or S-Corp. And so making that, I think we would have to just say something for the first $2 million of property value, because if we tried to make it only Montana businesses, you're going to get only sole proprietorships, and very few businesses are still under sole proprietorships due to the 199A law at the federal regulation at the Fed level. So I think we probably couldn't do that for just Montana. I think it would have to be all businesses.
And I certainly can't disagree with that because I only posted this as it is. I mean, DOR can weigh in on that concept. That's probably an LFD. Does Rhonda's statement make sense to you as well?
Yeah, I mean, at first blush, I have no idea how we would determine whether someone was a Montana business or not. It's always going to be down to how the legislature decides to implement that test. A flat exemption is fine, but I would really hope that we could split residential and commercial from class 4 if we were going to go down that road, because it's going to get messy in that section.
I've always thought the 4 and the 4A were a joke anyway, so that wouldn't bother me much. Dave?
Oh, I needed to lower my hand. I'm okay, thank you.
Okay, Comstead exemption, with that thought process in there, when you monkey with the homestead, given its 1.4 link, if that's the choice we make, we're going to have to come over into this side. Accommodation taxes, I'm gonna have to go through a few, then come back to this one so I can make sense of it. I should have moved this slide down, but I didn't want to change what was in the order. So total collections for fiscal year 2023 were about 119 million. This explains how we collected them. These are our surrounding states. Remember, we do an accommodation, which is kind of a tourist tax, hits Montanans as well, but the thought is it hits most of your travelers and even if it hits a traveler in Montana, it's helping pay for the services in the city they travel to. These are what the other states around us have as a tax state. When we add their sales tax and their income tax, now, of course, they're collecting their sales tax on the traveler when they're in the restaurant and other places as well. There's been conversation about, well, why can't we simply have like an additional 2% in July, August, September, some time frame, one of the quarters, bring in some additional monies and have those monies targeted to go back to the communities and buy down property taxes. I'm going to show you some charts coming in here on visitors, and then we'll go back and talk to that question. Like I said, I should have put these first. So here's 2018. You can see when the visitors come in. There's a lot more information in this chart. I'll stop on the last one and go through it, but it's essentially 12.5 million non-resident visitors that came in, primarily in April through September, mostly in July through September. I did start identifying here because I was thinking about these rental cabins and condos that are building 4.64 there. This is just doing it by year, kicked up a little to 12.6 in 19, dropped in that first year of COVID where everybody got afraid, except the condos went up. Getting back to its 12.5, and then let's look at 2022 here. And let's talk about this chart. I like the fact my yellow missed on the top, but oh well. So in 2018, the total per commerce hasn't changed a done. Fuel, well, the total in 2018 was it's damn near doubled on fuel, gasoline, and diesel in that time frame. Rental combos, they've doubled in that time frame. And there's other things in here. And as you talk about these local option taxes for tourists and that, some of this makes sense that we would look at these numbers. I was just looking at more the accommodation side. 2018, 1.8 to 2.46. I believe that's where I'm at on that. So there's some definitely interesting information in here that would need further work as we work on this. In fact, what I find always interesting is Q1 on hotels being that big. That seems somewhat strange, actually, when we go back and so actually before we leave that, is anyone able to address why Q1 on hotels is so big? Because it's so big in every year. Well, that seems an anomaly to me, but it would certainly, because it doesn't seem like when I'm running around in the wintertime, I get lots of reduced rates and there's empty rooms. That seems weird. We need to probably figure that out. Let's go back to the accommodation tax concept being, all right, we understand we're moving towards a tourist destination state. We are not a sales tax state. It is unlikely we're going to be one given its lack of popularity in any manner soon. I see I got a Q&A. I got to click on it in a second, but there could be a potential. Certainly doesn't have to be just a time frame I've picked, but the thought process, is there a way to connect And it's actually a question on both accommodation tax, and you'll see the next slide after that is fuel. Is there a way to collect monies there and redirect them as new revenue back into the time frame and see? Dwayne Iverson kicked out that was basketball tournaments potentially in the winter, but he's in the summer on the west side. You can't even get a room, but potentially that could be the answer. So comments, thoughts, discussion on a potential look at having some additional accommodation taxes collected, and then with a direct linkage, and whether it's just to residential or to property tax as a whole, to those communities that brought them in. That was the proposal that got sent in that I listed in the chart.
Representative Jones, this is Ryan Evans
Ryan.
from the, maybe one point on the timing of the accommodations tax there, just confirming that you are in fact showing fiscal year data, is that correct?
I'm showing the data you guys sent me.
Okay. So yeah, I'm pretty sure. So fiscal year Q1, is right gonna, or is it calendar year I'm seeing, Dylan?
It's calendar.
January, February, March.
Okay, and if it's calendar when it shows up, if that's when the revenue is collected, because there's approximately a quarter delay, I think, on accommodations tax, and some of the DOR folks can tell me if I'm wrong. Lots of times that tax that's actually due the end of September will actually show up a quarter later, which is going to be that 1st of January timeframe.
That is true, Ryan, but I think I'm reading the really small print down at the bottom of this table that this is survey data from like airports and stuff. So this is not tax revenue.
Gotcha. We'll follow up then. How about that?
So we probably need to do some, as we hold a conversation, if there's interest in these deals, we probably need to see some of this clearly, right? Because of the accommodation tax, oh my God, I gotta make all these little sliders come up. And again, I also think we are seeing some trends here. Overall, we did see an increase in fuel. It's interesting. I was curious if rentals and condos did Airbnb fit into that, because it nearly doubled. RV park use increased. So again, one, does this show a trend of an increase in visitation? And two is it does seem like the quarters don't make as much sense to me, albeit the bottom line of where the money's coming in does. It's just so weird right over there. Because then I'll just kick this up. So gasoline is also a discussion. There was an argument, well, why can't we during these timeframes where there's a ton of visitors add a couple cents, something to the gas tax, do the same thing, collect that money, then return it to buy down property tax. Of course, you got 50 to 60 million gallons of sold each month. It's a low in March and up in the summer. That would bring in some money. How the taxes are currently returned now, would they be returned? And of course, you're going to have your tax shift questions happen in here, because unless you design a system like the farmers used to have where you can turn in receipts, this is going to hit Montanans as well, because it's not that they don't drive in the summer. And of course, rebate systems are expensive. But a couple thoughts were some sort of a accommodations increase to touch some tourists, or a gas tax, and all the money going back to help buy down the cost of services in those areas that provide service for the tourists. So, and then we'll go through our little questionnaire, but Dave, I see you have a question.
I'm just going back a little bit in recent history and reflecting on how painstakingly difficult at times it was to deal with the gas tax increase and to deal with building the new state museum. And so I just want to point out that even though the allocation of this increase would go back to assist, I still think it's a pretty high hill to climb, and whether it's even deliverable, politically speaking.
Politics is going to play in. It's got the magic of the 2651-1 will play into our final answer here, as it always does, right? But without a new revenue source, then nothing changes. of some sort, right? We just shift within our existing folks. But yes, I remember very keenly how difficult every gas tax conversation was, or for that
It may
matter,
be that
accommodation
when we-
tax.
when we get to local option, I've been tinkering around with local options, is that that may be a more efficient way to do it that would also include the bed tax scenario in putting it together. It would not include the gas. So
Yes.
I guess we need to consider all these options together.
Yep, and there's a local option is coming next. You know, in our questions, tax shift between various property tax classes, this one would be probably a collection and a return. So I don't think it would be a lot of tax shift. Property tax and income tax payers. I guess it would be a benefit to property taxpayers, and depending how much was out of state, in state, the income tax would be an interesting. Montana residents and out of state. I guess if targeted appropriately, it would potentially be a shift towards, you know, a reduction in Montana. Local government and public school funding. You know, I guess it wouldn't impact them other than if it potentially brought down some mills, it might allow them to not have such a difficult time if they needed to pass some sort of a levy. Differential effect on counties across the state. Obviously, some counties are more impacted by tourism than others. So again, that would be some analysis as how does it go back and in what manner. Long-term effects on Montana's tax system. Well, again, if our argument is we're moving towards more of a destination tourism economy, this probably does recognize that at some level. An anomaly, I don't think it's an impact there. And of course, there would be a number of statutory changes. So, Dave, your hand's still up, and Nick, you've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, I was just gonna explain that chart. We sent those in, they are from the University of Montana. You're looking, in those numbers, you're looking at the average daily expenditure for a group. But if you look higher up in that chart, you'll see the actual number of groups coming, and the summer months are 3 times what Q1 is. So you're seeing like the difference between spending, you know, $31 on gas versus $28 on gas for a group. A little more in the winter than the summer, but there's 3 times the number of people here in Q3 in the summer. So you're looking at average expenditures. You're just not seeing the bottom number includes like the fact that there's, you know, 5 million people here in the summer versus 1.5 in the winter.
So again, so it is the total expenditures are still Q1's got total expenditures of significant. So the expenditures are a summertime overall, I see. So they're spending an average of 62 and 54 versus 33.
Yeah.
Average. So let's see, let's go to the hotels.
But you still have a ton more, you know, you still have 3 times the number of people here in the summer. So it's different. That's where you get the big numbers at the bottom.
Okay. So it's still a summertime, which made sense to me. And then maybe you would not have to match any change up with these quarters. That's just how this data came out. You'd probably want to look at it monthly, if possible, before you made or pursued some changes here.
Potentially, the university, this work by U of M it's some of the most reasonable stuff that we can find on this. You know, how do you track how many people are here? I mean, I think they have people out at gas stations surveying, as I recall, but I don't know if there's a better source for getting at how many people are here.
Okay. All right. Additional conversation there. Let's see where we're at. We'll better keep moving on as well. Those were areas that were sent in of how could we target more where the tuck moved. Obviously the end in mind. There are things that may not be politically possible, but I guess that they were set in. Local option sales tax, that comes up a lot. Obviously the argument would be targeted towards tourist items. The revenue collected must reduce property tax as the content's being set in. and some mechanism to share with the surrounding counties that border you. Otherwise, it's just a tax on your trade area if you're a big town. There's some other concerns about it. One, it might be subject to Montana's sales tax. I forgot the word tax cap at 4%. Which, so if there ever became a sales tax, there's a question of what happens between the two. It's likely to impact residents significantly as well, right? Since residents shop in all these places, and especially the trade area residents who may or may not benefit depending how it's designed. It is effectively a sales tax, right? But it's not distributed statewide, and thus there's significant questions of whether it can touch e-commerce. I try to get more modern data out of Dakota, but it looks like e-commerce is their 2020 data is 14.4% and rapidly growing. So effectively, you would also be going to places saying, hey, flower shop, you're charging more for your flowers, but the Amazon truck delivering flowers down the road isn't subject to this local option tax. So there are a bunch of concerns. It has historically been, in the art of the politically possible, almost impossible to have a local option tax on the 7. So there's a political challenge as well. That's the beginning of the conversation on local option. I look to all of you for your thoughts. Dave, your hand's up again.
I'll say that from the perspective of representing a community that has a local option, in other words, a resort tax, the trend that occurs in these resort tax communities is perhaps you get 55–60% approval when you first put it out there, and it steadily increases. The last vote we had, we increased from 2 to 3%. We had about an 83% approval. So this is just a perspective that it helps a lot with a good deal of transparency. I think when people can see where their taxes go, there's tangible improvements in their life. They also understand that in their minds, tourism has serious skin in the game, and there is a reduction in a current part of the tax system that's providing grievances to locals, such as property taxes, or if it gets back to renters. It can be a very successful model. I think the devil in the details would be at the local level. I think people expect some, for example, infrastructure improvements or something they can see that's being caused by the influx of visitation. So if you're on the I-90, I-15 corridors, you're going to see that growth impact by visitation. So if this were to go forward as a recommendation, I think figuring out what percentage should go back for tax reduction, and I think it's challenging to figure out the type of reduction in neighboring communities to balance it, and whether there would be enough to do all of this in a meaningful fashion.
Sandra?
Would it be possible to do a local option sales tax just during tourist season?
You could probably have it applied. That's probably a mechanics question of how easy to do, but could we kick it on for 4 to 6 months, a local option, a summer local option tax? Is that a possibility? I'd probably look into the DOR.
That's done in Gardner as far as a resort tax goes, where you can do it seasonally.
If that is available, because I've been really against it just because of all the other months of the year that the residents would be eating that tax. But if a summer option is available, I might be on board with that.
The other question, and Jared was working on this. Well, it's 2 questions. One, is it legal to say that it applies to e-commerce? And when I first asked him about it, he said, well, technically you could probably say it applies to e-commerce, put some money aside when Amazon sues you, because they're going to say there's no way we can do it. And when e-commerce sues you. But it would be for me a little more palatable if it touched everybody. But Jarrett was going to get some analysis. If I didn't have it for this deal, hopefully we'll have it upcoming. Rhonda?
I was going to make a few comments on just having looked at this and represented a number of people who were affected by this. As we've looked at it, for those of you who don't know, I used to lobby for the Vermont County Treasurers, and they quite often are the ones who collect this. That is the challenge with the local option taxes. There's no collection system. When you have a statewide sales tax, you have a collection system. So there's an easy manner to figure out how much is owed. And when you're looking at a small community, a lot of it's done on simply your good faith. When you start raising the size of town to Missoula or Billings or Bozeman, the major sevens, I don't know if you have that same small community ability to tell. Seasonally would scare my small retailers. The amount of computer programming that would go in to having to have our computers programmed differently for the business based on whether you were in city limits or out of city limits, and then what month it was, would be an absolute nightmare. And I'm a little concerned about how much of our small businesses are affected when you move it to e-commerce. Because when I'm saving sales tax by ordering online, our small businesses in the state already struggle to compete with you ordering everything online. And if we added another incentive, I think that would be really hard on our Main Street businesses. I think I'm not opposed to a sales tax statewide, but in a local area where you choose one business over another based on how much the sales tax is, I think that becomes very, very difficult on our small businesses.
Okay, other thoughts on local options? Okay, again, options being set forth. I know a number of the communities, Missoula, Billings, a number of the communities themselves, especially the bigger ones, have been pushing this harder in recent years. It certainly could potentially be a new revenue source. It certainly may have a difficulty. And we'll see what Jarrett comes up with, but may have a difficulty in ensuring that it touches e-commerce fairly. It does anger the surrounding shopping areas significantly because it's a tax on them, the surrounding counties, that they don't often get a benefit from. I've seen some sharing models being built. I'm sure this will be another potential that comes out. So with that, we'll keep rolling on unless person's got more questions on this. Okay, thoughts, discussion, direction. I guess I should move the slides. Another area that, and this may overlap some with the education block. But I got to explain it, then we'll go into it. So Montana's school system is 397 school districts for about 155 students. I think it's about 150 now, but anyway, with the concept that these are always not perfected numbers, I believe the 397 is. This is the type of school districts. It's a massive number of school districts. It's an unusually high number of school districts relative to student load. Montana 397, 150,000 students. Depending where you pull this data, this will move stuff, but it seems to be correct here. But 397 school districts, 155,000 students, $12,000 per student. North Dakota has 153 with 114 students. They're about 14,000. They have some unusual funding that they put a lot of oil into their kids. South Dakota has 148 school districts with 120,000 students, putting in about $10,000 per student. Idaho has 115 school districts, 307,000 students, about $8,000 per student. Wyoming has 50 school districts, 90,000 students, putting 16,000 in. It's getting from their coal tax. Colorado has 178 districts, 883,000 students, putting in about 11. Utah has 41 school districts with 667,000 students. I went through this to merely to show that this 397 school districts tends to be very unusual and very high. And And a lot of these states are very rural like we are, because I always get hit, well, this is a rural state. Well, I think South Dakota qualifies, so North Dakota, potentially Wyoming, but they just have less taxable districts. Is there a possible way that this could get a better alignment and encourage some efficiencies and not forced consolidation? I'm not opposed to attendance centers. I'm talking about tax efficiencies and administrative in this system. Wanted to show you some of these just so they make a little more sense to you before we hold a conversation. Here's the picture of the Flathead, one high school district, 10 plus, and I think I heard it was now 14 elementary districts. Each one of these districts is a different taxable jurisdiction. Over in Savage, and I got some more from Eastern Montana, here's where the school is, but the district isn't even contiguous. There's a district around an oil field. Here's Melstone. You have a rural elementary district that somehow is split between 3 high school districts. Here's just a picture of Eastern Montana districts, because in our mind, when we think of a school district, or at least I think of a school district, I think of a school with kind of a circle around it where most of the kids come from, and that's the tax area. But each one of these colors is a district. And there's just kind of a unique layout back there. And I would argue a whole lot of that has more to do with tax and tax avoidance and tax equity than it does with where the students live. What that causes is some weirdly different tax rates across these districts. Statewide on the residential, right? This is part of the tool. And so that we already have online. Residential local schools, you have an effective last state tax rate of a 0.20 statewide. It's nearly double that if you go to where we at. We're in Fergus County, so it must be Lewistown. It's nearly double that. If you go to Madison, it's well, a tenth of that. It's 10% of the number. These are the effective tax rates. If you go to Billings, Yellowstone, it's 0.28. The point being that there's massively different rates. So here we know that schools consume about 56% of all property tax dollars. Some districts have incredibly high mills, some have very low mills. A single county can have a very low milling district and an extremely high milling district, and the line might not have a lot to do with where the kids go to school, although House Bill 203 has helped at least with that. There has been some suggestions put forth that maybe we should move to more a K-12 district concept. You take a high school, you're not getting rid of any place kids are going to school, but maybe there's a high school, and if those elementary services, it's just one district for administrative purposes, and any low milling tricks that are being done, etc. Because as always, there's a tax shift, right? If you find a way to keep yourself in a very low district, someone else pays more mills for the kids, right? And I live up in an area of the state where there's been some very creativity done to be able to join to make sure your property's in low districts. So one, maybe a K-12 concept. If you look at the picture I showed you at the of Kalispell, you'd have one district there, but it's not just Kalispell. Sydney is served, I believe, by 3 elementary districts. Maybe it'll not be just one district. And some of those districts have some oil money, some do not, right? So you'd equalize across that tax base and potentially be able to share some administration. Another possibility is this is kind of what happens with the retirement mills. You say, fine, you can have all the districts you want, but the base levies are equalized, not the voting ones, but the base ones are equalized across the county, right? You're not going to get any tax break for hiding across a line somewhere. It's going to be equalized. Another possible suggestion would be you could define what the isolation strategy is. Again, how you get there, the devil's going to be in the details, right? How do you incentive the formation of K-12 districts? How in some of these, what the devil's in the details, but 56% of all property tax dollars goes to schools. We have 397 school districts. It's a kind of a unique system. It certainly is where most of our tax dollars go. It's interesting to step across a line, and on one side of the line, well, I'll tell the story of an ex-legislator that, I won't say his name, but a friend of mine, and owned a massive chunks of property. And there was a little school on the property. I won't even say its name because they never know, but it was a little small school on the property that ultimately closed. And so that property owner, along with a bunch of others, looked around because their kids were going to a town school a few miles distance. They had an option of having their property join up with the taxable area where their kids were going to school, or they could join with a Hutterite school that was just down the road. They joined with the Hutterite school. I said, hey, why'd you do that? His answer was 40 mils. Did nothing wrong, was absolutely right, but if you pay 40 mils less, someone pays a few mils more. We have a very, very interesting school tax system. We are indeed a rural state, so I'm not suggesting that attendance centers change, but given that more than half of all of our property tax dollars service schools, we know, or at least anecdotally, the argument is, even with the fact we're putting what appears to be quite a bit of money per student out relative to some other states, we can't seem to get it to the teacher classroom quite as well. And we seem to have an administrative overhead that's a little bit higher than normal. Is there some interest or something that could be done here? That was what drove this slide and being part of this. With that, I'll quit talking and let out anybody else that wants to weigh in. And I know Mr. Melton had said he might weigh in, but I don't know if he's on this morning. Well, I don't see him, but anyway, at that point, discussion, thoughts? Dave, you got your hand up?
Yeah, thanks. This is good stuff. You know, I was, like a few of you probably out there, on a school board for quite a while. And I mean, one thing that would happen if, for example, looking at our area, if you simply said, yes, you have isolation status, you define that clearly, but that every district has to be attached to a high school.
K-12 concept.
Right. I think that's probably something worth studying, but you've gently mentioned like tax havens of districts and people moving to districts that are rarely going to go above the base level. So we would see probably many more districts go above, former districts go above the base level as they're absorbed by more urban districts. I think the other thing that would be interesting to know is how does it affect education? Because I'd like to think that's what this is really all about, is providing as close to a first class education system as possible. So I think considering this, and then also seeing some effects on educational deliveries and opportunities would be pretty valuable.
On the education note, as a guy that looks at education outcomes all the time, we don't consistently do a better job of providing education outcomes at this point in a bunch of the other states that have much fewer districts. But obviously that one, it is all about education. So it would have to be, what does that impact? But when I look at the names on that list, and you can compare outcomes yourself and go look this up, the NAEP and the other outcomes, we aren't consistently higher performing in education outcomes because of these additional districts than the vast majority of states that have fewer districts. That's just a comment. You know, thoughts? Wow. Let's see, the Q&A thing popped up again. Make sure that's nobody new. School conversations usually generate much more interest. I was trying to make sure I moved along quick enough so I didn't get caught for ages in a school conversation. Because I believe thoughts and suggestions. So thoughts and suggestions. So we've touched upon a number of things, right? We've touched upon a couple versions of homestead exemptions. Some of them are already being modeled because the Legislative Fiscal Committee, the LFC, had asked for a model to be built to look at the homestead exemption items. There's fiscal notes out on the transfer to income tax model. That's conversation there. There was discussion again of a potential accommodations tax in some sort of a seasonable manner, and where the money is returned to those areas that are providing the services to help buy down the property tax that is currently paying for the services. The same conversation linked somewhat to the fuel tax, and I'm not talking about the political feasibility of these yet, merely what got brought up. The fuel tax and the same thing. A local option tax, where the conversation was all or some of the monies collected would go back to as a new revenue source to help touch the additional or buy down property tax, all or some. And of course, the plethora of school district Montana run. Again, recognizing as a rural state, we're probably going to have a lot of attendance centers, but do we need that many invisible taxable lines that force us to have additional administration, etc.? You know, and again, I always give an example. A AA school potentially has a superintendent, an assistant superintendent, and a business clerk serving, well, if it's billing 17,000 kids, there might be 800 kids in Monterey County, and it has 3. Right, so 3 superintendents. Is there some efficiencies there? Not changing the attendance centers, but finding a way on these taxable lines that mean so much to some of the people that are adept at managing. Those were the things we talked about so far that got sent in or brought up to me. A number of you have raised the concerns that come up with these, but as we talk about tax fairness and equity, we talk about where the puck is moving, which appears to be, at least in the western 60% of Montana, more of a destination economy, right? And the eastern is a natural resource. We've looked at the flatlining of the natural resource items. Those were where we were at. Every change we make are going to have folks that will think it's a good idea or propose making, or a bad idea. We're going to have to do some analysis to try to come up with that. So with that lead in, thoughts, suggestions from the members of the committee? Are there other things that didn't come in? Todd, are you there? I thought I heard you say something. No, it just popped up. So Todd, you weren't, were you trying? No, you just said.
Yeah, Representative Jones, I'm here, and I'm probably more perplexed now than I was when I started, which probably isn't saying a lot, but I guess one of the questions I did have, kind of going back to this school thing, do you know the evolution for those states that have smaller school districts? Was that something that was forced upon them, or was that more of an evolution that Montana has adopted into creating these many districts that we have?
Probably something we need to do some research on. You know, I know where our districts came from, and I would suspect they began the same. You know, you built a little school somewhere, drew a ring around it where the kids came from, and that was the district. So the real question is, how did it evolve so they have less districts, yet we have consistently kept our lines? Or there's been some reduction, but it's slow. But that's something we could probably do some research on. You know, I need to, I see on the attendee side, I believe some of the school folks were on, Julia in particular, and I'll try to make sure that gets back to Pad. Promote Julia for a second. I don't know if she knows an answer to this, if she's paying attention or it's just not her name there. But I don't know that. It's something that between Julie and Pat we could probably research, or between Nancy Hall and Zach. Julia, were you listening?
I was listening. I don't know the exact history, but I know there was kind of a movement for consolidation in, I think, the 50s that Montana kind of missed out on. that some of the other states picked up. I would probably have to talk with Pad about it a little more, but we can definitely get back to you on that.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, Representative Jones, there may be something looking at there, because, you know, one of the things that I think we have to avoid doing is recreating a wheel. If somebody's created a wheel that we should look at in another state, right? Maybe that's a part of it. And I do think at the end of the day, it's probably relatively minor in the big scheme of the issue, but it may be that we come up with a variety of arrows that we have in our quiver that, when bundled together, may make some substantive impact on the property tax.
Yeah, at least create some incentives and some pathways so that we can potentially address this. Dave, is your hand up because you have a new question?
Yes, thank you. I'm wondering if there is another subcommittee assigned to look at like PTAP and elderly homeowners as to like evaluating those programs. Are they being underserved? Should they be having more scope to them?
I believe, and Representative Hertz was on. I believe Representative Hertz's committee has that task assigned to it. Let's promote Greg as well, and he can speak to that, because he was doing the local government end. If not, there are certainly topics that I assume were being assigned to other committees.
I as far as what Todd just said, I think it's a good opportunity to look at this school district issue. It seems to me, when I came on the school board in the early 90s, perhaps we had more than 500 school districts.
Yeah,
we actually are reducing school districts, but you know, the numbers that you have shown at least indicate that a state can have a quality school system with far fewer administrative units. And it would be interesting for this committee, the subcommittee, to have data that would show that while retaining your quote neighborhood schools, or many of them that have the enrollments to carry them, that reducing administrative units, and you've cited the example of between Billings and Pend Oreille County, you know, what type of savings would we have on property taxes, or could internally there be more of a shift that would have more dollars available, or districts would have more dollars to invest in the teacher's salary schedule or something like that. So I think that would be valuable to know. And I'm assuming, my final question is that 587 is being looked at by education, and that will eventually have an update on that as far as
David Beatty's section. Yes.
Okay.
So I believe, if not, if Greg, did you get promoted? Are you there? And he might not be able to speak. I see he's there. But I believe Representative Hertz's section is touching on that. All right, yeah, we'll investigate. We'll find a way to investigate how and why. But I do these because I believe that is the correct topic. Why is there a district line in a given area with massively, my conversation about selecting for millage instead of kids because the kids were going to the other school? And can we share across some of these lines some administrative overhead? 1 year for taxes. Other ideas, thoughts?
Representative Jones, I apologize. I haven't been able to locate how to raise my hand here, but one of the things that occurred to me when we were talking about the non-resident or the part-time resident, and I think there is a good case to be made that they're probably paying more than their impact in property taxes. But one of the things that is also true with that is that they are helping to contribute to the increase in the value of properties in their area, right? You have a wealthy out-of-stater come in, purchase a home or build a big expensive home, and it contributes to the increase in the value of the other properties. And so while they are certainly, maybe subsidizing, if you will, the tax base because of their pull on the services in that community, they are raising cumulative the property value in the entire area. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I think it's part of, in my mind, it's one of those things that I think we have to keep in mind is that there is an increase in valuation that we're seeing from some of this sort of activity, particularly in Western Montana.
Yeah, no, and I agree. It is something drove the price increase, and it was unlikely it was purely Montanan. But it resulted in meetings. I see Senator Hertz is online. Senator, you heard the question. I believe actually you typed the answer in the chat, but go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I did. I'm sorry. I was waylaid by something else. But no, our local government subcommittee will take a look at those various taxpayer assistance programs and see what we can do, if anything, and just getting more information out to taxpayers on the use of those.
Okay. Additional thoughts, topics? Okay, I'll ask that question again then after public comment. Raise your hand if you're an attendee that wishes to do, or if anybody wants to do public comment, and let's take our public comment at this point. So I am not seeing any hands go up, at least on my end, for public comment. All right. And again, I still see a few of the other tax committee members in the other group. So if you wish to speak to anything, feel free. And no chat hands. Let's go back to the panel side. No hands here. Well, I was trying to get about a 2-hour deal, and I left an hour because I figured public comment might take us there. So we kind of met our 2-hour discussion. So I guess I'm going to report out, unless the committee has a different direction. When we get together as a group, I'm going to report out on these, the ones that I have on my list. Hopefully, I know this show itself this PowerPoint was recorded. I know that hopefully we have some notes, so I would ask that Ralph, who gets to be my main staffer, begin, and Ryan, we can put together the report out to include some of the comments that were made. And because our next meeting, I believe, we're supposed to bring back the problems that we've been trying to address, and we talked that, and our not the analysis of the solution or potential solutions. Is that Ryan? Are you there? Are we on track to provide what you want?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think you're exactly right. I mean, at this point, we don't have a formal agenda for the next committee meeting of the whole, but we anticipate a big part of that will probably be the report out by the subcommittees. A little bit of discussion if there was any, I don't want to call it final points or recommendations at this point, but if there's any, topics that you guys have as a committee decided you want to take on. I know coming out of the education committee, they had maybe 6 or 7 topics, follow-up type of things that they were probably going to be working with staff on developing out more. And I guess maybe now would be a good time to make a little bit of basically an explanation of what that template was that we sent out last week too. And hopefully that can help guide, you know, not only you, but the entire members of the committee, to basically formulate your thoughts as you go, to the extent that you are developing recommendations. Again, it's probably a little bit early for the straight up recommendation stage, but many times it's once you think you've identified a problem, that template is something that you can work through throughout the process of this subcommittee, whether you have 1 recommendation, 10 recommendations. So when you ultimately do report back to the full committee, it can come in some consistent, cohesive manner. And so everybody at the subcommittees and the full committees will be able to review the recommendations similarly. Also, for the staff perspective, it will be a little bit easier then when we're ultimately drafting what becomes your ultimate report to the governor. We'll be able to do a little bit more cut and paste. There will be some formatting that we can use. And so, yeah, Mr. Chair, this has been a great discussion that I've been able to listen in on, for my opinion. I think it's really at your discretion if there's, you know, tasks that you'd like to make, or if you guys are at a point where it's more of a consideration and you want to continue to organize on any specific topics that you want to address or dig deeper into. But, you know, some of that can certainly be a little bit of regroup with staff too, as we develop ultimately your next agenda too. So I'd say you're definitely within the buoys of what we're imagining for this process. And, you know, basically the discretion is yours at this point, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so my thought process is and I'll work back through the show. I'm going to suggest we continue with to investigate. The problem appears to be that Montana has substantially more school districts than the vast majority of states that surround us. We can investigate this, but the thesis is it hasn't appeared to produce better educational outcomes. It has potentially had some administrative inefficiencies, and it certainly has resulted in even within a county, a discrepancy in taxable mills, and that's a problem that we need to potentially see if there is some incentives or solutions we could work towards. So that'll be one topic, the area, and of course I believe, and with the folks on that the local option sales tax, potentially with more information on whether that Jarrett's doing added to it, of whether it can touch e-commerce, potentially a look at what I know some of the other areas are speaking about, models that share with surrounding communities, etc. Kind of flushing that out is probably going to be a topic that's certainly worth following up, and this potential seasonality of it. And if I'm saying something that people want to weigh in on that's different, obviously this option sales tax, a significant portion, if not all, you know, Dave Fern's, Representative Fern's thought process is, you know, maybe there's something that needs to be built with it, but certainly I think there's little interest in it if it doesn't help the local property tax payers. Potentially some sort of a seasonal gas / tourist tax linked to the information we've seen here, where the money goes back to those areas impacted by these tourists, and how you would do it, the accommodation tax. We had a couple homestead exemption possibilities and some of the challenges with them. I believe that's currently the LFD's fleshing out the one model and potentially going to be able to speak to the Comstead exemption numbers some. This second model, House Bill 399, the transfer and the shift to income tax, probably need to at least do some examples and put some stuff together there so we can see. I haven't seen the modeling across counties and such on it, on what the impact would be. But I don't think there was any argument that we should be looking at the homestead exemption models. Oh, and there's one I didn't get in here. The other one that got brought up, and I need to, dang it, I thought I had a slide for it, but I didn't get in here. The other thing that got sent in, so I'll have to stick it in under the other idea, the little pretty idea deal, which is here somewhere. I gotta move it so fast. Well, the one thing that got brought up and said to me I didn't get on this was there's a conversation that came up that got sent in, and they said and actually Helena was the example. They said a whole significant portion of communities now have become, there it is, under this slide, our consumer service. We have a ton of nonprofits. They used Helena's, nonprofit, state government, etc., that are consuming critical services, fire, public safety, and that a hospital, the Capitol building, the nonprofit, whatever it might be, whatever these are, certainly require fire trucks to show up. They probably like when you call 911, police showed up, that there's some base services that are being consumed, and that is it correct that's a significant portion of property doesn't participate directly in the provision of dollars, kind of a concept. Is there something that maybe in a community shouldn't just be milled and it misses all the nonprofits, or should there be something that says some key services are maybe assessed on a citywide taxable basis? The idea being that some of the growing footprints that aren't participating in the provision of these services are causing a tax shift or transfer to the remaining residential owners, commercial owners, etc., that are participating in these services. And so I'm sorry, I meant to put a slide in on that and I forgot till I was flipping through and thinking about it. I would like to throw that out as just a discussion. Is there any thoughts on that? Comments?
Representative Jones, we actually had that bill, that topic as a bill from Representative Essman in the tax committee. And I think that it's I think now that we've had more time, or I've had more time to think about it, it was kind of a radical approach, because you always think of nonprofits and, you know, you don't tax nonprofits, et cetera, et cetera. But put in the context as you're expressing it, yes, they get a significant tax advantage, and perhaps it's appropriate to say most are very worthy of it. But on the other hand, for emergency services, as you use as an example, there arguably can be said there's a tax shift involved to service vast amounts of nonprofit, non-taxable properties. I think having more information on it and knowing like what percentage are we really talking about here would be helpful.
Okay, Rhonda?
One of the interim committees is looking at is working at compiling a list of the nonprofit properties, if I remember correctly. I'm assuming it's revenue committee, but I'd have to double check. So we might have that. I did just pull up a few of the nonprofits in Cascade County because I know that they do get a tax bill and I didn't know what it was for. There already is a precedent for taxing them for streets and lights. At least here we do. So there is something to look at in a way that they're taxed. However, those are assessment districts where everybody pays for the cost of the streetlights. So they're assessed per property, and we don't really do police or fire per property. But there is something to look at to do that. And I do know that that list of nonprofits, it's been many years and it's been requested numerous times. And that list is really, really long of property that falls into that nonprofit list. And some communities are highly impacted. So it might be worth looking at.
So it appears there's at least some interest in pursuing this concept. Rhonda provided some background. To hopefully the department is hearing this as well, so that we can see what we can, you know, because potentially a problem in our tax shift, tax avoidance deal is as a share of our tax base has a growing number of nonprofits. Maybe there are some services, for lack of a better term, that need to be more on an assessment basis, so that because the Capitol needs a fire truck too, if there's a fire. So I guess since it's hard, I don't see any hands up saying any more. Without objection, I'm going to add that to our list. And so Ralph and Ryan, I think you heard that as well.
Got it, Mr. Chair.
Okay. So unless someone has something else to say for the good of the whole, I do not see any hands up, any additional conversation. We are going to be well within where I thought we would be. Any additional thoughts are good? The whole, well, thank you for spending your Monday morning. Oh, Rhonda, you have your hand up again? Rhonda?
I did have one thought that I would maybe like to look into, like us to think about, and it's probably not going to be real popular, so I hope the press isn't online. The two small ones that we're looking at, the gas tax and the accommodations tax increase, neither of those generate very much money. So to me, it would look like maybe doing that seasonally would be more difficult than just doing a 1% year round or 2% year round tax increase than trying to figure out what season the tax changes and then businesses having a problem with that. I also would think that if we attempted to rebate that in any way to Montanans, that would actually cost us more money than that would be a bureaucratic waste of money that was not a lot of money going back to any one person, but a lot of time and energy put into a rebate. So I think we may want to, if we're going to go with a bunch of small arrows and quivers, like in the quiver, like Todd suggested, that maybe we want to look at those as being year round instead of just seasonal, so that they're enough to matter collecting.
Okay, we certainly can expand our analysis of those in that manner as well. Additional? All right, with that, I guess we'll go ahead and adjourn. Thank you for spending your Monday morning talking tax. It's such an exciting topic to spend Monday on.
You all.